So my name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Welcome back to the virtual reading group. I know we had a vacation last week. It was spring break. So I hope you're all getting back into reading Hannah Arendt. We are in pretty much smack dab in the middle, maybe just a little past the midpoint of the lectures on Kant's political philosophy, which we're currently reading after having read The Life of the Mind, or the parts of it that Arendt finished. Just to get us back into the groove a little bit, let's remember, we were reading The Life of the Mind, and the question that we began with is the question of thinking. Thinking withdraws from the world. Thinking is something that is not that has to, you have to sort of withdraw in order to do. And the core, I think the core claim of that first book on thinking is that thinking concerns itself with meaning, not with truth. We then read the section on willing, in which we encountered the problem of freedom. To what extent, when we will, are we free? And we learned from Arendt that in pretty much the entire history of Western political thinking is designed to control our will and our freedom, because our will and our freedom are seen to be dangerous, to lead to dissent and disorder and rebellion. And so philosophy is about the discovery of truth and order to control freedom. We then turn to the question of judgment, which is the third of the mental faculties that Arendt is going to talk about. She doesn't write that book, and we are turning to different texts in which she talks about judgment to try and maybe glean or understand what she might have or what she did think about judgment as the third part of the life of the mind, these mental faculties. Insofar as one approach is her lectures on Kant's political philosophy, in which she talks about Kant's, tries to develop in Kant a political philosophy, which he himself arguably never did. She focuses on the third critique, the critique of judgment, and argues that Kant's politics is found in his aesthetics, in his thinking about beauty, thinking about the way we are touched by things, the aesthetics of things, and that's strange, and it's really revolutionary. It's fairly radical, and Arendt, I think, has found something deeply meaningful and important in the theory of aesthetics. In short, what she finds in Kant's doctrine of political aesthetics, or aesthetic judgment, is a way of creating a public sphere, a public realm, a common world, right? These are words that those of you who've been reading Arendt with us or on your own know. A common world. What is a common world? A world we share in common. The very idea of a politics. Politics, from the Greek word polis or politeia, which comes from the Greek word pelein, a verb which describes the motion of the smoke rings that go up in a circle from a peace pipe. Politics is also the origin of our word pole, right? A pole, which stands in the middle, the North Pole or the South Pole. Politics is the activity of gathering a plurality of people around a common center. Politics is about what unites a plurality of people, people who are different, and holds them together. The politician is the orator who speaks something that people say, aha, yeah, that's right. And thus they see themselves as part of the polis and thus gather together and become a people. And so if you understand politics in that way, aesthetic judgment, the judgment in which you say, this painting is beautiful, and you don't mean, I think this painting is beautiful. You mean, I can persuade you that this painting is beautiful. Or if you understand it and beauty rightly, you'll also agree that this painting is beautiful. And thus, what aesthetic judgment do is it makes a claim that I make subjectively to impartial truth about beauty. And a political judgment, Arendt says, is the same thing. I make a subjective claim that the war in Ukraine is wrong, that abortion should be a right, that healthcare should be a right. I make a subjective claim that has no truth value. It's a meaningful claim, but no truth value. It's a judgment. And I seek to woo you, persuade you to that judgment so that we agree that that judgment is not my subjective judgment, but is an impartial, general, public judgment. That's the fundamental connection between aesthetics and politics that Arendt really revolutionarily argues for and finds in Kant, but in a way that Kant himself had never spoken it so clearly, and if at all, and certainly no one else had seen it in Kant before her. This factor of publicity, of publicness, which she talks about in lecture 7, which we read the last time we met, which I know 3 weeks ago, which is why I'm doing a little bit of review. This factor of publicity is necessary, she says, for all critical thinking. And it is the power to think. And because of it, the power to think depends upon the power to speak in public, in a community with others. Because if you take away the public power to speak with others, you take away the fact that others will disagree with you. And disagreement and plurality are absolutely crucial to critical thinking, but also to judgment. Why? Because in disagreement, we can, of course, rebel and simply say, you're wrong and I'm right. And then we retreat into our little bubbles, but that's not politics for Arendt. In disagreement, we encounter someone who challenges our judgment. We have to not refute their objections, but weave them into our own, as she says Kant does, or says he does, when encounters objections to his own work. This is on page 42. We have to, she says, view the object from every side so as to enlarge our point of view. This is the idea of an enlarged judgment. An aesthetic judgment, if we're talking about a painting, but a political judgment, if we're talking about a policy or a war or an election. So that she says that we have to, in both aesthetic and political judgment, train one's imagination to go visiting or wandering, as she sometimes says. And this is the core of what she here is arguing is going to be the connection between aesthetic and political judgment. Now, there's a problem that emerges with this argument that she now spends the next two sections, which we're reading today, trying to grapple with, right? The problem is that if judgment is based on this general disinterested standpoint, this standpoint of one who stands apart and looks and tries to generously think from the perspective of many people. Judgment, therefore, requires what Kant calls a world citizen, and what Arendt says he should have called a world spectator. And so that general standpoint is always the standpoint of the spectator, not the actor. And so she quotes this long quotation from the conflict of the faculties, conquest of the faculties, which we sort of mentioned at the end of the last session, but didn't really read. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but one sentence near the beginning is worth taking a look at, where Kant says, and this is on page 45, it is simply the mode of thinking of the spectators which reveals itself publicly in this game of great transformations and manifests such a general yet disinterested sympathy for the players on one side against those on the other, even at the risk that this partiality could become very disadvantageous for them if discovered. Owing to its generality, this mode of thinking demonstrates a character of the human race at large and all at once. Owing to its disinterestedness, a moral character of humanity. In lecture 8, she says this is what Kant meant, and I think she gets it right. She says 5 things. First of all, that when we judge as a spectator, whether it's aesthetic judgment or political judgment, we're not concerned with the deeds and misdeeds of men. We're not concerned with the fact that the people who made the French Revolution maybe committed some human rights violations. We're not concerned, with the fact that Ukraine may have some neo-Nazi Azov battalions, right? We don't get caught up in those small details. The importance of the deeds, she says, is not for the actors. It's for the spectators. And the reaction of the spectators is not about the details, but about whether the event gives us hope, whether it turns us in the end toward progress for the human species. And thus, as a spectator, what we're concerned with is the meaning of the event that we bestow upon it. So on page 47, in the lecture 8, she will write, this is citing Kant, right? The hope that after many revolutions, with all their transforming effects, the highest purpose of nature, a cosmopolitan existence, will at last be realized, within which all the original capacities of the human race may be developed. The point is that if in this conflict between the spectator and the actor, between the judge and the actor, Kant doesn't side with the actors, the men of the revolutions or the men of war. He sides with the spectators. He says all rebellion is unjust, but that doesn't mean that dictatorship is just or legitimate. Both the dictator, actor, and the rebel, actor, for Kant, are unjust. That's an extraordinary claim. There is no, with one exception for Kant, there is no justified rebellion. And there's very few justified rulers, because most rulers are in the end unjust. So The hope for mankind doesn't come from actors, Kant says. It comes from the spectators who assign meaning to the action. Thus, Kant can condemn the action of the rebel and then celebrate the new constitutional republic that the rebellion brings to be, Arendt says. She gets caught up here in a little bit of Kantian inner-side baseball, but the reason she says that Kant says you should not rebel even when the rebellion will bring good is what Kant calls the transcendental principle of publicness, and Arendt cites this on page 48. The wrongness of the despot can be shown because no despot openly says he is a despot and a tyrant. Therefore, you'll never claim that I should be a despot. Similarly, the wrongness of rebellion can be shown because no rebel says that when it's expedient, we should overthrow the state, because once the rebel is the state, they will say, no, you must obey the state. So there's a clash here, she says, between the principles of action and judgment, and it needs to be resolved. What's the clash? The clash is that from the actor's perspective, we want to act, and yet no action is justified. From the spectator's perspective, we don't act, we judge, and judgment makes meaning, but then we would never act, and we need action in order to judge. So how do we resolve this clash? She says that there are two assumptions that Kant makes that help him resolve it. One is the assumption of progress, right? That we judge with the assumption that the world and human species progress towards some better end and better state. The other is the assumption that evil is self-destructive. And what she says is that in both these assumptions, the assumptions of progress and self-destructiveness of evil, it is the spectator who is decisive. You look at the war in Ukraine, and there's a lot of action, and there's a lot of heroism, and there's a lot of beauty, and there's a lot of pain and evil, and there's a lot of refugees, and there's a lot of death. All of that is there. But if you're going to make the war in Ukraine meaningful, you assume that it will lead to some progress, or you hope that it won't lead to some regress, progress towards some better world. And the spectator is the one who judges whether it is progressive or not. And so now she turns in the 9th session and says that we have to understand the different perspectives of the spectator and the actor. The actor is caught up in all the single and contingent events and haphazard happenings. They may act in ways that a spectator will see as heroic or beautiful or awful or illegal, but the actor's caught up in it. The actor, in the end, doesn't make meaning. It's the spectator, because they are not involved, who can perceive the design of providence or nature, can thus assign a progressive narrative hidden from the actor. And thus it's the spectator who gives all authentic meaning to action. And then she turns to war and says that the spectator thus always prefers war over peace. Peace is decadent. In peace, the businessman rules, and the businessman is boring. They're not very courageous. They're not very, they're not sublime. They don't risk their lives. They don't act in ways that inspire us for the most part. Whereas in war, we encounter men who shrink from nothing, who fear nothing, and therefore do not yield to danger. And we venerate the soldier and the hero in this way. And so she says, in the question of war, the actor must choose peace, but the spectator must choose war. And then she says that what most counts most is not the actor, but the spectator. For those of you who've read some Simone Weil, in her wonderful, brilliant essay, The Poem of Force, about the Iliad, Simone Weil makes, I think, a similar point, right? Which is that without war, human life would have nothing meaningful in it. War is what gives us justice, because if you don't have something you're willing to fight and risk for, you have no higher ideals like justice. War is what gives us beauty. War is what gives us all of the higher ideals, Simone Weil writes in her essay, The Poem of Force. And Arendt and Kant here agree from the perspective of the spectator. Not only that, so not only in war, but in philosophy. So if those of you who remember your Plato's Republic, you may remember the very first line of Plato's Republic, where Socrates says, I went down yesterday to the Piraeus with Glaucon to pay my devotions to the goddess, and also because I wished to see how they would conduct the festival. The beginning of philosophy means leaving the polis. What is the polis? The space of appearances. It's the place of action, and going to the field of the spectacle, the festival. Philosophy is a spectacular activity in the sense that it concerns itself as a spectator, as a disinterested outside party looking in on the world from the outside. She cites on page 55, not Plato, interestingly enough, given her usual interest in Plato, but Pythagoras, who writes that life is like a festival. Just as some come to the festival to compete, some to ply their trade, but the best people come as spectators, theate, right? Theatrical people, audience members. So life in the slavish men go hunting for fame or gain, the philosophers for truth. And so this is part of the elevation of what in the human condition, citing Aristotle, Arendt calls the vita contemplativa, which largely reigned supreme until the modern age, when it was replaced by the vita activa. And in this vita contemplativa, the spectator is disinterested. They withdraw from direct involvement. They are impartial, like the judge. Arendt herself calls herself, in her own self-analysis, a conscious pariah, one who consciously stands outside of the action so that she can better spectate on it and think on it and judge it. And so the supremacy of judgment that Kant, at least for Kant, is underwritten by the idea of progress, the idea of hope. Now, those of you who have been with us again know that for Arendt, she doesn't accept this idea of progress. So to the extent that Arendt is going to, if she is going to embrace the idea of the spectator and judging the judger, it's not going to be on the basis of progress. And this may give you a clue that she's going to at least complicate the Kantian and the Aristotelian to Kantian privileging and supremacy of the judge and the spectator over the actor. Okay, I think I'll stop there and welcome you guys into the conversation. There's two ways to engage in the conversation, as many of you know, and if you're new, you'll learn. You can engage in the chat, which I'm going to largely leave to you. I do remind you and request of you to be civil and thoughtful. You're welcome to disagree, but do it in a way that you don't attack the speakers. Secondly, you can raise your hands through the raise hand button down under the reactions label at the bottom of your screen. And we can engage in hopefully a wonderfully productive discussion of these sections of Kant. All right, let's begin. Stephen.
Happy to be back. Welcome back, everyone. It's very interesting that Kant writes so much with theatrical metaphors. You know, the actor, the spectator, and it strikes me that he wasn't able to be political in the sense that we are since the revolutions of the 18th century. He was a thinker of the Enlightenment, and it's striking that Lessing, who was an inspiration for Hannah Arendt and Diderot, were both playwrights. And I think theater had a prominence in Enlightenment thinking that it doesn't have today. And of course, Hannah Arendt gets her theatrical metaphors, which uses a lot from starting with Kant. And I wonder if you would comment on that.
Yeah, it's a good point. Arendt also, at the end of her essay, What is Freedom, talks about the theatricality of politics as well. It's a place to go and look for what Stephen is saying. Yeah, for her, politics is a theatrical. Okay, so let's. I mean, I've said that the fact that she doesn't believe in progress is going to complicate the Kantian analysis. She accepts the Kantian approach and finds it incredibly provocative and inspiring in a good way, insofar as what it reminds us is that politics is about the art of making judgments that build a common public. And to make those judgments, you need to judge something, which means you need actors in politics. Just like to be an art judgment judge or an aesthetic judge, you need paintings or birdsong. You need actions, you need politics. And so you need those who get on stage and act. And those who get on stage and act can be theatrical actors, but they can also be politicians or citizens who enter what she calls the space of appearance, the walls of the polis that are built through constitutions and laws and allow us to act and be taken seriously. Very early in her writing career, long before she wrote The Human Condition, in chapter 9 of Origins of Totalitarianism, when she's trying to write about human rights, Arendt writes a line which I think is one of the most central lines to all of her writing, which is that the only truly human right, the right to have rights, which she'll call it, is not the right to live or the right to eat or the right to housing or the right to medical care. It's the right to act and speak, to speak and act in ways that matter. It means that it's the right to be a member of a polis, to be a member of a politics. It is human to matter. and to matter, to be meaningful, to matter. And it is human to be meaningful and to matter. And to matter, you have to be able to be seen. You have to be able to appear, which means that people have to be able to judge you. Now, they can judge you and say you're irrelevant, you're not an important political actor. They can judge you and say you're evil and we should kill you or send you into exile. And they can judge you and say we want to elect you president, and all sorts of things in between. But it's human to be acting, and that's to be judged, and to matter. And so that's why action for her is such an important quality. And action is based on plurality, that there's disagreement. And action is at the core of politics in that way for Arendt. But action doesn't itself make meaning or make a politics. Action is I don't know if this is the right word, and I sometimes use it in my classes. I'm not sure if I should use it. Action is the raw material. It's the matter. But it's the stories that the judges tell about the actors and the action that matter, which is why artists, for Arendt, to bring you back to Stephen's theatrical metaphor, are so essential for politics in Arendt's telling. Her politics is an aesthetic politics. It's a politics that says that the activity of politics, as opposed to the actions in a politics, is the talking and wooing and judging and persuading, which then can lead to more action, which then will lead to more judging, persuading, wooing, etc. And so in many ways, if you think about modern houses of democracy or of politics, where you have sort of a semicircular room with stage seating with speakers in the front, they look like Greek theaters, right? Because the actual activity of politics happens in the talking and judging of actors. And that's a very theatrical model. So yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't know if that's good enough, Stephen, or if you want to add anything to that.
Well, that's very good and very helpful. And I would simply add that when Hannah Arendt describes the courtroom in Jerusalem, she describes it as a theater that is stage managed from behind the scenes by Ben-Gurion.
Yeah, well, I mean, she thinks of theaters as spaces of judgment. And obviously a courtroom is also a space of judgment, a house of justice, as the, I forget the exact Hebrew terms, but anyway, I think the courtroom was called a house of judgment, house of justice. But yes, a courtroom is a space of judgment. A theater is a space of judgment. What do we do in a theater? We boo, right? We judge. And so is a political amphitheater called a Senate or a House or a Congress. Okay. I know you're not Tim.
Thank you. I'm not Tim. I'm Monica.
Hi, Monica.
Sorry about that. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you. I've really been enjoying this lecture series. My question is, as I was, the thing that attracted me to Hannah Arendt is this, this sort of conception that I have that what she's advocating for is that it's unique to human ability to create a world and bring about change, which I'm interested in very much, just fundamentally. And so I'm trying to square that sometimes with some of the things that I read that make me pause and say, that's not a direction that I would want to go if I'm talking about change. And so specifically related to the readings for this week, on page 55, when she's quoting Kant in his discussion of war, as in some sense, you know, you judge the actors different than you judge the spectators. And, ultimately war could, from a spectator's point of view, be a force for progress, and also a force to bring out the highest capacity of humans. And whereas peace, even though war could be, in a sense, like, and I think Hannah Arendt also agrees, could be something that actually promotes peace because of its horrors. It could also be something that brings about this sort of flaccidity or boredom. And specifically, she uses, she quotes and doesn't comment on this term effeminacy that Kant uses in relating peace, the negative aspects of peace. So my question is, I have two questions. Maybe the first one is a comment, and maybe she'll get to this eventually, but I find it, this idea of war is in some sense a good and beautiful thing is troubling on one sense. And I know you sort of alluded to that in your lecture, this idea that war can also bring about beautiful things. And then also just maybe some context around this word effeminacy. So thank you so much for.
Can you just point me towards where you're finding the word effeminacy? It didn't step out to me, so I need to find it.
Oh, okay. It's on page 53.
Oh,
at
53.
The top. Yeah. In the quote of Kant, where he begins, what is that which is even to the savage an object of the greatest admiration?
Mm-hmm.
And then it continues, it's a man who shrinks from nothing, who fears nothing, and therefore does not yield to danger. Then he talks about the joys of war, or the good aspects of war. And then on the other hand, at the bottom of this quote, a long peace generally brings about a predominant commercial spirit, and along with it, low selfishness, cowardice, and effeminacy, and debases the disposition of the people.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks for your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, no, it's a good question. In the early in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, there was an enormous outpouring of intellectual literature. I can point you to people like Max Scheler as one example, but many of them, arguing that the European civilization had become economic, bourgeois, corrupt, soft, and we needed a grand war to cleanse it and return it to its real values. You hear this in other realms as well. So, I mean, for those of us who lived through the financial crisis of what, 2009, right? You'll remember that around the world, central banks bailed out all the bankers and all the people who had borrowed unbelievable amounts of money on leverage and made irresponsible bets all over the world. And there were people who said, let them fail, let it all come crumbling down. And other people said, no, you can't do that, because if you do that, the whole world is going to come crumbling down. What happened, of course, is you bailed everyone out. And the lesson learned by many people was, well, you can take irresponsible risks because the governments will bail you out. What is this called? Moral risk, no, moral hazard, or whatever it's called. The premise is that there is a moral desire by many people at times when the world is seen to be corrupt, low, selfish, cowardly, to understand that the only way to sort of reset it is to let a kind of conflagration blaze, right? Whether that's through war or economic disaster. And I think the insight that people like Max Scheler and Kant and Arendt are expressing here, and they're not the, and Simone Weil and many others, is that, you know, humans have an enormous capacity to do great things. And yet on our day-to-day life, consumed with bourgeois and other economic concerns, we don't. And if you want man to realize the heights of humanity, you have to put him sometimes in extreme conditions. The bigger point is that if you actually want justice to be an idea, you're going to have to threaten man with injustice. If you want peace, you don't have to threaten with injustice. You can have a kind of, we could all be programmed. We could all be fed bread and wine and water and not have to do very much. And so that's the basic idea. I mean, I understand some people are going to rebel against this. As Kant says, you must rebel against it if you're an actor, because you're the one who's going to be dying and you're the one who's going to be like suffering. But without war and without depression and without those things, those horrors, human life would become selfish, cowardly, and he uses the word effeminate. You know, what do I want to say about that word? It's an 18th century usage. You know, I think it means for Kant a kind of concern for life and welfare over and against daring, boldness, and courage. Interestingly enough, I don't think it's historically accurate. If you, although it's actually interesting, I used to do a lot of research on revenge cultures. And if you look at a lot of revenge cultures, it's often the women in those cultures who call for acts of revenge and the men who resist them, but then have to do them. And in a way that sort of perfectly sums up the spectator actor distinction that Kant is here offering, which is that the spectator is concerned with meaning, the need for revenge and for justice, but the actor who has to actually do the revenge and then will get killed in return is often hazarding to do it. And so it's, in that case, it's the men who are cowardly and the women who are demanding action. So it's just an interesting opposite point of view. I don't know if I'm going to satisfy you if you're, you know, like if we're a pacifist, right? And I'm not saying you are, Monica, I don't know. But if one is a pacifist, this is not going to satisfy them, except to say that what Kant would say is that if we were all pacifists, we would live an inhuman life. Because it's an inhuman, not in the sense that we wouldn't have death and horror, because we would, people would still die, but inhuman in that we wouldn't have justice, and we wouldn't have beauty, and we wouldn't have images of courage and heroism. And so the spectator knows that, and thus can call for a war. It's very easy to sit here and say, this war in Ukraine is great. It's bringing NATO together. It's reinvigorating the West. It's teaching us that we have to stand up to authoritarianism. But if you're in Ukraine, it might look very different. That said, at some point over time, if Ukraine manages to win or at least survive, the meaningful stories that are told about this war will be deeply inspiring and important for Ukrainian ideas of freedom and democracy. and resistance to tyranny. I don't know. Does that, I'm happy to, I'm not sure if I've helped you in any way or confused you more or just said the same thing and still doesn't help.
No, I loved it. Thanks for that.
Okay, thank you.
Roger, may I just talk for a moment? I think
Yeah.
there's something here. I wasn't sure when we began this series of writings, and there was a woman who is an art historian, I believe, and she was warning us that we've got to look carefully at the language. And I think we have to look carefully at, somebody just used in the chat, Kant was old-fashioned. I think that is an interesting use of the word, as if ideas of progress are fashionable. And they like the hemline of a woman's dress and so on. He was old-fashioned. This is the same man who just in that same quote said savages.
Yeah.
Well, so, and let's not go there. I mean, he thought a good proportion of the world literally were not at the standard of a European. And I say that, wasn't it true? This man never left his town. Isn't this true? This man sat and read about the French Revolution. He's not a street fighter. So in a way, we have to, I thank him for his thoughts, but we have to contextualize and decide how much weight does he have literally in our present discussion. Effeminacy is an old term from European men, right? The English said the French were effeminate, the French said the English were effeminate. They're like, what use do we make of this right now? Anyways, let's acknowledge the speaker, and let's talk about how does history and historical figures, how do they work in the discourse that we're trying to fit into our present communication. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, so you take effeminacy, right? Which, is, as Bill said, a word used by male thinkers, or at least I think imagined by male thinkers. I'm sure some female thinkers used it as well, but there you go. And you take savagery. You can take civilized, which of course is a complicated word. All of these things in Kant have a history to them and are located in the 18th century. And we should be aware of that. I mean, Kant did largely, I don't know if he ever, but stay in Königsberg and never leave it, famously. He read widely. I mean, Arendt in an earlier essay talks about how he read geography to broaden his mind and seek to be impartial. But, he was a man of prejudices of a kind of Protestant German European guy. I've been teaching Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism this year, published in 1950. Brilliant book. Many of us have read it and found great inspiration in it. And yet she also talks about savages in the book. And we've spent a lot of time going over those passages and going over those words and asking, what does that mean? And what does that mean for the book? And, what I've tried, there's a lot of ways to talk about it, but one thing I've said to the students is, she's a woman with prejudice. And who doesn't have prejudices? Every single one of us has prejudices. And so you can't expect any of us to speak outside of those. I mean, we can try and question our prejudices, but in 30 or 40 years, everything I'm saying now, people come back and say, oh, he said this word or he said that word. Who knows, right? But you should acknowledge the prejudices. You should seek to undo the ones that are problematic. And when we read Kant or read Arendt, we should acknowledge their prejudices and understand that they were people of their time. We should then have to constantly ask ourselves, do these prejudices require us to revise our understanding or thinking about their texts, right? So does the word savage here or the word effeminacy here require us to rethink the text. I mean, let's just stick to effeminacy because that's the one more, I think, at issue with what we're talking about. You know, is this claim that Kant, Simone Weil, Arendt, and others make that war has a salutary, meaningful role? Is it buttressed by the idea of something like effeminacy and masculinity in culture? Well, I think you just have to say yes. Does that prejudice for a kind of masculinity, and that therefore, in a sense, buttresses our belief in the importance of war and the meaning of war, mean that maybe we should question that belief? That's an interesting question. And, you know, if it were the masculinity of war that was behind our desire for war, or our valuing of war, then I think you would have to say yes. But again, that's not Kant's or Arendt's point. It's that justice and ideals would not exist. Now, is that the case? And maybe there's I think you can, and I think people have made feminist cases to say that, you know, it's not only war where we encounter such hardships and disasters, and there can be others. But you know, and I'm not going to be able to run through this all right now, but all I'm saying is that I think encountering a word like effeminacy or savage in such a text requires that we then, okay, so look, first acknowledge the prejudices involved, and then ask ourselves to what extent those prejudices require us to rethink the text. Steve.
Thanks. As usual, I find distinctions that Arendt draws upon or draws out to be useful, but sometimes too stark here between spectators and actors. So a couple of thoughts. First of all, it seems to me that every actor, whether it's a lawyer arguing to a court, a stage actor, an artist, a performance artist, always has an eye on the audience, on the spectators. In other words, you're trying to convey a message or persuade something of a proposition. And so, I mean, in reality, it seems like in the mind of the actor, one would always be switching back and forth between being very in the now as to what I am doing and always wondering how is that playing to the audience. And indeed, I think a lot of political actors, office holders, have a keen eye on how they will be seen by history, because history, it strikes me, is the ultimate spectator. Because as the story becomes better known and better revealed, we come to finer and finer degrees of judgment as to the consequences of actions and whether they are admirable or even despicable. And the second thing is that I am surprised that she is not, and Kant for that matter, it's hard to tell who starts where sometimes in reading this, not more mindful of past, present, and future. The actor is very much grounded in the present, but as I suggest, they always have an eye on the future. And the spectator is always in the future to some extent. It's always, you know, some delay between what is happening and the spectator's judgment, and our quality of judgment, our reliability of our judgments are always affected by time. In other words, time reveals more and more. It tends to, almost inevitably, I would say. And that's not, I haven't seen that addressed here either. So, you know, the role of time, of past, present, and future in these judgments, and the interplay of actor and spectator are not addressed, at least in what I recall having read so far. And I think those are important points to my thinking.
Yeah, great question, Steve. Or points. Not questions, so I'll just respond to say I think you're right. I don't know how many times I've said this to you all over the last 9 years or so, or 7 years or 8 years, or however many years we've been doing this. Arendt makes distinctions. The distinctions are thoughtful, they're provocative, but they're not supposed to be hard and fast distinctions, right? So, people go on and on about, well, she makes the distinction between labor, work, and action. And yet, when you work, you're also acting. And when you act, you also can judge, as you said. And of course, and she knows that, they're not there to sort of isolate. And just like similarly, the distinctions between social, political, and private are not meant to say there's a pure social realm, a pure public realm, and a pure private realm. There almost never is. And so here, she makes the distinction. Well, Kant makes this distinction between spectator and action, which she is putting into play, and to some degree is going to call into question, right, as we go through this book. And this distinction is undergirded by a temporal, to use Steve's idea, by a temporal idea, which is progress, which Arendt is going to dispute, right? She's going to say there is no progress. So that's going to cause problems for this distinction that Kant is based on, that we're going to have to confront in the next 3 or 4 essays or lectures. And we're going to have to the extent we continue to talk about judgment without progress, we're going to have to complicate the spectator actor divide. I think, Steve, it's an excellent point. It's one that needs to be remembered, and I should say it more. I try and say it whenever I can. And I also thought your point was really quite nuanced when you said, yeah, if you're a theater producer, if you're an actor, where you're in the theater or in politics, you've got one eye on your action, but you've got a little eye, back of the head eye, on how people are going to view you, right? I mean, we all know that politicians care about how their actions are going to be seen. There's no doubt about that, right? So, yeah, I mean, the idea of a pure act or a pure spectator is fanciful. And that's why theater is such an interesting metaphor, one that Arendt uses, because in the theater, you produce acting designed to be seen. And then the spectators act by telling stories about it and make the play either successful or not. Not to mention the fact that the response of the theater can often have input into the quality of the performance, the acting. So, yeah, I mean, these are never hard and fast distinctions. I think it's a good point. So I accept everything Steve said.
I wish I had been as persuasive with juries as I just was with you. Alas, it doesn't always work.
There you go. Mr. Conklin, is that right? I don't know. You're up next. W.C. Conklin or W. Conklin?
Yeah, W stands for William.
William, hi.
So I greatly appreciate your readings, and I've been going through Life of the Mind on YouTube. My question, I think you've sort of answered, but I'll ask it again anyway. So when Kant, and I had taken Arendt as supporting Kant here, which you seem to say we have to wait and see whether she does. When he lifts the appearance of the world, the events, into impartial and disinterested spectator, are they lifting the appearance of the world into metaphysics, into the world of concepts, of pure thinking about concepts?
Oh, right. Yeah. No, that's a great question, William, and the answer is going to be no. Let me see. It's back, I think, in the 7th section. I believe it's in the 7th section, which we read last week or a few weeks ago now, where she says that when we speak in a disinterested way, we're not speaking conceptually. Let me see if I can find it so I can just point you towards it. Oh boy, I've lost it. Oh no, yeah, it's at the bottom of page 43. So where she says that enlarged thought is the result of 3 things: abstracting from the limitations, those are prejudices, right? So if we have prejudices, we have to abstract from our prejudices, our limitations. We have to, second thing is disregard our self-interest. And third is we have to think more generally. And then at the very bottom of the page, William, she says, this generality, however, is not the generality of the concept. For example, the concept house, under which one can then subsume various kinds of individual buildings. It is, on the contrary, closely connected with particulars, with the particular conditions of the standpoints one has to go through in order to arrive at one's own general standpoint. The point is that impartiality or generality is not about concepts. It's about when I judge an act, whether it's a bombing or a painting, I have to let my mind go wandering. I have to, as Bill said, whether I walk to Italy and walk to South Africa and walk to Japan and try and incorporate other prejudices and critiques and become awareness of my prejudices and my limitations and my what holds me back, and weave those into my judgment. Or whether I read about other judgments and weave them into my judgments, whichever it is, I have to do that. And then I have to seek to remove my self-interest from my judgment. And then I have to judge the bombing or the painting or the artwork or the dance. But that's not conceptual, which is why I've said this a number of times, and I'll say it again, probably many more times, and I apologize, but it bears repeating. Arendt doesn't talk about objectivity. She talks about impartiality. Objectivity would be a kind of me against something, a kind of subject understanding an object, and there's a kind of conceptual subsumption. Impartiality is that I seek to expand my limitations and bring in as many different opinions as possible. They're very different ideas in her work. Okay? Does that hopefully helps? Great. Adolf or Adolf? Adolf or Adolf?
It's fine. So just reading the work and just listening to you, one of the big things that I began to think about was the nation, inherited meaning, patrimony, or patrimoine, or like, I guess, like heritage. And in terms of like being a spectator, often I feel like as folks, as part of the polis, we're spectators of the past. We're spectators of things we don't see. We're spectators of things that like were related to us and were translated to us through like historians and that kind of thing. Like I think about anything from like the civil rights, the Haitian Revolution, the 60s, or whatever it may be, and how we center them in our lives and in our judgments and that kind of thing. And I really began to think about, if Arendt was challenged by that, the concept of the nation, inherited meaning, and the fact that often in the polis, like what we're passing judgment on, we'll never see. We just think we see because we've been told them. But yeah, I just wanted to ask about that.
No, thank you very much. It's a good question. The answer is, of course, we all judge from particular, prejudicial, traditional, national, ethnic, racial, sexual positions, right? I mean, no one doesn't. Even artificial intelligence, we're told, has biases built in by the assumptions and programmers and things that are put into it. There is no such thing as a completely disinterested, non-prejudicial judgment. And so, we all struggle with that. Politics, Arendt, in one of her essays, in the collection, The Promise of Politics. Politics, she says, is the effort to understand and resist our prejudices. We can't run away from the fact that we humans are prejudicial, that we make unthought judgments every minute of every day based on prejudices. It's just who we are as humans. And yet politics is the attempt to become self-conscious about those prejudices and decide which ones we want to keep and which ones we want to give up on a regular basis. It's an ever-going process. So as a national, whether you're an American or a Russian or a Ukrainian or a German or a Japanese, as an internal level, right, you're engaged in a politics, but you also have to understand that as any of these nationalities, you have prejudices and you're going to see the world in a certain way. And there's no universal. What there is, from her point of view, is an ideal of cosmopolitan disinterestedness in which each of us, from within our particular prejudices and our place and our gender and race and religion and nationality, makes an effort to bring in as many other perspectives and weave them into our judgments as possible. And that's Arendt's ideal of thinking. It's also, I mean, she argues here, it's Kant's ideal of thinking. I mean, it's not something that many Kantians had seen before Arendt picked it out. Leaving Kant to one side on this, it's an effort to be critical, to be a critical thinker. And that's sort of at the very height of Arendt's thought. And to the extent that we have to give up progress, right, which is what I've said a couple of times she's going to demand to some degree we do, we have to be willing to do that without the hope of it leading somewhere. And that's a difficult thing. To demand the hard work of critical thinking without the promise of an Eden, a utopia. That's the really hard demand that Arendt is going to make of us, that someone like Kant doesn't, because he gives us the religious hope of progress, right? And Arendt is living at a time 200 you know, this is for her, progress is one of those prejudices that Kant fell prey to. And why I think Arendt is such a brutal thinker in many ways is that she does away with that. What she offers us is not progress, but the possibility of meaning and freedom. That if you think the way she says we have to think, she says we can live meaningfully and freely, which may and then in turn by other people be seen to be prejudices. But that's her approach. Does that do anything? I mean, I don't know if I can answer too much the question about the nationality, but I think I've tried somewhat. Is that helpful?
Well, I think in terms of your use of the word struggle and effort, I mean, that went to like what it is that I was saying, like how it is that you struggle with certain things that are like, that are impossible. Like how it is that like judging can be so imperfect because often you don't have the information, or often because you've been offered this thing that you don't really know the information of something that's past. And I think the idea of a struggle or an effort, I think really answered it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think for her, thinking is a struggle. And it's also dangerous, right? There are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous. Because what does thinking do? What makes it dangerous? It dissolves all prejudices and thus leaves us in a kind of potentially anarchic, nihilist state. And if thinking were to really succeed in dissolving all prejudices, it would be highly dangerous. Okay. I'll keep asking and I'll try and keep answering. Fran, you're up next.
Hi. I would like to go back to the text to page 58 and go to the last paragraph where she writes, let us draw some conclusions. The conclusions didn't make really sense to me. And so I would like to, is it okay if I tell you how I understood this paragraph so that you know why I'm asking these questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so she says that in the center of Kant's philosophy is history, which is perpetually in progress. And the subject of this...
No, in the center of his moral philosophy is the individual. In the center of his philosophy of history is progress. That's what you're reading.
Okay.
Is that, am I reading what you're reading?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Okay. And the subject of this history is the human species itself. Right? The subject of this history is the human species.
Yeah.
Okay. And the essence of the subject cannot be determined because the value of their existence can be revealed only in the whole. So no man can ever, where is the quote? I'm going to quote. This question cannot be answered, for the value of their existence can be revealed only in the whole, that is, never to any man or generation of men, since the process itself is perpetual. So not one individual can value this subject of this philosophy, which is history. But then there seems to be a general standpoint where an individual spectator can come in and make a judgment about this subject that cannot be understood by an individual. I can tell you in other words, like I try to understand what this means and why it doesn't work for me. It's like, let's say you cannot taste sugar. You don't have the taste buds to taste sugar. And then they put 3 pineapples in front of you, and then they say, judge these pineapples. And then you say, well, I'm going to judge them by the standard of their sweetness.
Right.
That's how this feels to me, this whole thing. Like, how can you judge something to which you have no access to its essence?
So, okay, fine. Great, good questions. So what we're trying to do here is, as we're encountering this distinction, this clash between the spectator and the actor, right? And she said that in from Socrates up through Kant, we have privileged the spectator, right? To go back to this, is we haven't talked about this in about an hour, but that's the context of what's coming right before. Can everybody just mute themselves? So there's a desire to there's an elevation of the spectator, and within this elevation of the spectator, she asks, right? Progress is the standard by which to judge history, because the spectator judges towards some higher progress or end. Well, who is the subject of the story, right? Whose progress? And in Kant, the answer is the human species itself. Hegel, it's a little different, but we won't get into Hegel here. But in any case, we need to judge it. The problem, as now Fran has revealed, is that if we are judging the human species on progress, and then we ask, well, what's the essence of man? We can't answer it because we don't know where the end is. And if the end is always in the future, come back to Steve's temporal issues, then we can't make a judgment of the whole. We can't say what the essence of man is. So what can we do, right? We can't say what the essence of man is. We can say that in the philosophy of history, which is about the perpetual progress of the human race or the mankind, we can imagine spectators, world citizens, world spectators, who impose their prejudices on the story that you're telling. So I don't know what the essence of man is, but I look at a war in Ukraine between Vladimir Putin and Mr. Zelensky, and I say, this is a war for freedom, right? What have I done? I'm not telling you what the essence of man is, but I'm based on my prejudices that I think man is about freedom as a liberal democratic person of the late 21st or of the 21st century. I say that, and I decide that that's a good prejudice and a good story and meaning, because I have an idea of the whole, namely that the world is about freedom and democracy and meaning, and I impose my meaning on it. Does that mean I'm right? No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean I know what the essence of man is at all, but it means I impose my meaning on it.
But can I ask something?
Yeah.
The idea of the whole, if that is related to a general standpoint, as she says, like a world spectator has like a general standpoint, how can you see the whole, especially the world, which is like a globe, so to say, if I talk in pictures, like then you look at one side of the thing, but you cannot see the other side if you have this standpoint,
Yeah.
unless you're moving really fast. So how can you call yourself a world spectator who has an idea of the whole if you cannot even see the other side?
Well, you know, it's an aspiration, right? You know, Bill said Kant never left Königsberg. He read some books. It's true. No one can walk and visit and talk to everyone in the world. And even if they could, which they can't incorporate weave all their opinions into it. So you make an effort. The general standpoint is an attempt. I sit here in New York City, corporate capitalist Mecca, right? And I try and understand the war in Ukraine. And I try and understand why Ukrainians fight against a much bigger army and why they claim that they're doing so. And I try and understand why Russians believe that Ukraine has to be part of Russia. And I make an effort. And I make an effort to understand why South Africa, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia won't condemn Russia. Why countries that represent more than 50% of the population of the world have not condemned Russia. And I make an effort to understand that. So I read my colleague Sanjeev Barua, who tells me that it's all about race, right? I put this in the Amor Mundi last week. And he says that the war in Ukraine is seen by most of the non-European world as a European war, as a war about the future of Europe. And that's a racial category. And most of the people in the world don't care about it. And so I try and let my mind go wandering and hear these judgments, not as things to refute, but the things to weave into my understanding. And do I ever succeed fully? No, absolutely not. But that's what I try and do. And that's what she thinks judgment is.
But why I didn't understand the conclusion is because it seems to be an individual responsibility. Whereas like, I didn't understand why this has to be a individual responsibility in this kind of like logic where she says the essence can only be understood by the whole. Why is it not like a communal judgment that makes the judgment or like
because we're all dignified human individuals. We're not part of a Borg. I don't know if that's a reference that you understand from Star Trek, but we're not part of an artificial intelligently designed, digitally enhanced brain so that we can have a communal judgment. If it's going to be a political judgment, we start from the fundamental assumption Arendt makes about all politics, which is plurality, that we are different. And each one of us has different interpretations, different opinions, different views, and all of us are entitled to respect and dignity in our opinions and our views. And so when you hear someone who has an opinion or view who's different than yours, you don't recoil and reject it. You try and understand it, and then you try and interpret it and weave it into your own. Now, again, the danger and the mistake, she says, is this is not empathy. You don't try and empathize with them. You don't try and say that I understand them, because I sitting here in capitalist, corrupt New York will never understand someone in Beijing or in Ukraine or in Kiev. She doesn't think that's possible. All I can do is take their thoughts, their arguments, and understand them, not empathize with them, but understand them and try and incorporate them into my arguments, with the hope that I can create a disinterested general opinion to which I can woo as many people as I can, and we create a political community.
I fully follow you with this, but you talk about understanding, but she talks here about judging. So like you can do your judgments on in the way you just described it, but can you really judge as an individual? I guess that's my fundamental question. How can you judge? I mean, like you can to some degree.
Well, I don't, yeah, Fran, let's just start from basics. I can judge. I can think that the Ukrainians are fighting a good war, or I can say the Ukrainians are fighting a bad war. That's a judgment. Every one of us can judge. So you mean something else. Tell me what you mean.
I don't, but no, I cannot judge. I cannot, that's my point. I cannot judge if that's a good or bad war. That's exactly my point.
Well, you can also judge that you don't know, but then you're just,
no, I cannot judge. I can maybe know.
oh, come on. You judge many things, and you judge every day. You judge that it was worthwhile to spend 2 hours listening to some idiot talk about Hannah Arendt. I mean, that's a judgment you made. You make a judgment every day. You make thousands of them. Arendt says to judge is to be arrogant. You're arrogant. I am. We're all arrogant. The problem, she says, with the modern world is that too few of us are willing to accept the arrogance to judge. And if you say, I can't judge, what I'd say to you from an Arendtian point of view is you're not taking on your human responsibility to make judgments. Now, that you make judgments doesn't mean that you don't listen to other people. You say, I judge and I don't listen to you. I think I should get a vaccine. You don't, I'm not going to talk to you. That's not judging. I mean, it's a judgment, but it's not an enlarged mentality. And it's not accepting the plurality of the world. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
I disagree, because like based on this logic that she laid out on this page, which is like, this is, you know, like it's not even private or personal to me. I'm just trying to follow this logic. It's impossible to judge as an individual, because if I can only understand, if I do not understand the essence of my subject matter, as I try to find this like maybe stupid example, if I do not have the taste buds to judge sugar, and then I go out and say, let me judge these pineapples based on their sweetness, like how is that supposed to work?
Well, you don't have to have the answer in order to make a judgment. Judgment is not about truth. It's an opinion. Right? I mean, I don't know if freedom is the essence of the world, but I can make a judgment whether I think it is or isn't. I don't have to know the answer.
I couldn't.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think you can. So I'm unsure why you think you can't. But all right, I know, Bob, you've had your hand up and we're out of time. Bob, you want to ask a quick question and then, or you want to save it?
You defined prejudice, and I forgot how you defined it, but something unexamined. How was it?
A prejudice is a prejudgment, prejudgment. And so if a judgment is an examined judgment that seeks to be critical and take in the perspectives of as many people and weave them in as possible, a prejudice is a prejudgment before you critically evaluate it.
Okay, so here's the conundrum. You eliminate all the prejudices, you eliminate self-interest, you eliminate, I don't know what else, then how can you make a judgment? Where do you stand?
She doesn't think you can eliminate prejudice. This is part of some of the discussions we had about a year ago when we were reading some of these essays. She doesn't, I'm writing a longer essay on this now for an essay on creolizing Hannah Arendt, for a book on creolizing Hannah Arendt. But the idea, I don't want to end on such a controversial note, but excuse me, the idea of anti-racism has often today gotten confused with anti-prejudice. And they're very different for Hannah Arendt. You can't get rid of prejudices. You can get rid of racism. But what you can do with prejudices is constantly rethink them and reevaluate them and criticize them. And that's what she thinks politics is.
Okay, so what's the difference between a prejudice and an assumption? You have to have some assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, prejudices are unthought assumptions in some way. They're unexamined. That doesn't mean they're wrong, and it doesn't mean they're thoughtless, because they could have been thought by people 150 years, 200, 300 years ago. Kant said savages and effeminate, and we continue to repeat it, and it's prejudicial until Monica and Bill say we should evaluate these words. And when they do, then we have to, remind ourselves. We can't take these assumptions for granted anymore. Okay, we're out of time, so I'm gonna let us go. But thank you. This was a great conversation. I'll see you. Just to be clear, there was a mistake on the website, and today we read lectures 8 and 9. So for next Friday, we're reading lectures 10 and 11, and I look forward to talking about them with you. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.